I doubt you could even imagine it, but there was a time when From Software didn't dominate the video games industry, where the mere mention of their name would only rile up a select group of people, leaving the vast majority unaware. But when they introduced the world to Demon's Souls and its spiritual successor Dark Souls, something began to change. Gamers all over the world had finally begun to take notice, not just of this company, but what they were bringing to the video games industry. An entire subgenre of gaming that was reminiscent of classic games, yet maintained enough modern mechanics to keep them firmly in the present. It cannot be overstated how far From Software has come since then. But following the release of the Ring City DLC for Dark Souls 3, From Software began work on what they considered to be their biggest title to date. It would be a game that Hidetaka Miyazaki would consider to be a natural evolution for the Souls series, featuring an open world, various new gameplay mechanics, and a world crafted by a well-renowned author. Safe to say that this game had the potential to be From Software's greatest to date. However, the question has to be asked, is this simply an open world Dark Souls, or is it something so much more? Well, let's find out. This is Elden Ring. Taking place in the Lands Between, a vast fantasy land populated by a myriad of gods, monsters, and other unspeakable horrors, you are tarnished. Exiles who have returned to the Lands Between after the shattering of the Elden Ring. Where once the Elden Ring dictated the order of the Lands Between, now that it's broken, chaos has gripped the land, resulting in a great war between the demigods, each of whom fighting over the broken shards that was once the Elden Ring. With the gods at war and the land ravaged by death and decay, it's left to the Tarnished to try and set things right, by seeking out the demigods and taking their shards in order to restore the Elden Ring and become the Elden Lord. It's a familiar setup, but one with enough differences from the rest of From Software's games to keep it fresh. On this journey, you'll encounter a wide cast of characters, from wolfmen to giant turtles, witches, and even talking pots. Many of them seem to be trusting, but all of them have their own dark secrets and stories to tell. The world of Elden Ring is the perfect blend of absurd and dark fantasy. You'll often be befuddled one moment and horrified the next, an especially common occurrence whenever you tackle the bosses. The world building in Elden Ring was done by fantasy novelist George R. R. Martin, who's best known for the Song of Ice and Fire series. What he did was effectively give the developers a guide from which they would build their game from. This has had the added benefit of making the story much easier to decipher than in past games, since much like other From Software games, the story was designed to not be explicitly explained, meaning that the player has to piece together the narrative for themselves. But from the environments to the character designs and even the dialogue, one can form a pretty clear picture of the Lands Between. In time, you may even discover the many side stories that lay hidden throughout this vast fantasy land. But if you're not interested in piecing together the story, then I wouldn't worry. Thanks to some stellar music, sound design, and voice acting, From Software is able to easily keep you invested in the moment-to-moment gameplay. It's hard not to keep your eyes glued to the screen whenever you come face to face with one of Elden Ring's many horrifying bosses. It's a perplexing narrative, but one that features all the charm and intricacies that we've come to expect from these developers. From Software are exceptionally gifted at visual storytelling, and Elden Ring is another marvelous example of this. It goes to show that your dialogue doesn't need to be coherent in order to tell an engaging story. Sometimes all you need is a clear-cut goal backed up by some solid gameplay, which Elden Ring has in abundance. If you've played any of From Software's games before, then you'd already have a pretty basic understanding of Elden Ring's gameplay. In short, it's all about taking your time, recognizing patterns, and managing your resources. The general gameplay loop of the Soulsborne genre is to dodge or block incoming attacks before punishing your target, after which you back off and wait for the next moment to strike, keeping in mind how your enemy behaves and what moves they may employ next. Elden Ring more or less continues this. Throughout your journey, you'll be dealing with a wide variety of different enemies, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, just like you. So mastering the combat will require patience, studying your enemies to learn their attack patterns and striking whenever possible, managing your stamina and making sure you have enough energy to evade if necessary. But should you take too much damage, then you'll need to use your Crimson Tear flasks in order to regain your health. However, you only have a finite number of these and you can only replenish them by resting at a site of grace. So since you can't naturally regenerate your health, avoiding or mitigating damage is essential to staying alive. But should you die, then try not to feel too discouraged. Death is frequent and victory victory is never guaranteed, especially against the bosses. Even if you manage to deplete a boss's health, then don't be surprised if it suddenly stands back up for another round. If you lower your guard for even a second, then what was a straight up battle can quickly become a nightmare scenario. One where you now have to deal with a fully replenished foe while you're stuck with no way to regain your health. Furthermore, don't expect this game to throw you a lifeline if you're in a bad spot. The sad truth is, if you keep dying in this game, more often it's because of your own actions rather than the game's design. Elden Ring is a game where success isn't just dependent on how well you understand its mechanics. More often it's because of your character's build and how you choose to play the game. Like any other RPG, you start the game by first picking your class. Each one has its own benefits and disadvantages. Some provide you with good weapons for close quarters, but poor stats should you want to use magic. Others give you access to the arcane right from the get-go, but at the cost of making your character more vulnerable. But in the end, what class you pick isn't as important as what kind of stats and gear they provide you. Because unlike other RPGs, From Software doesn't restrict you from using certain weapons, magic, or other items simply because of your character's class. Instead, the class system serves more as a starting point for how you want to play the game. Whether you want to fight up close with a blade, from a distance with a bow, or by tapping into the arcane. There's a wide variety of ways you can tackle the combat in Elden Ring, with these only being a few examples. So you could just play it safe and stick to one weapon throughout the whole game. But thanks to the massive plethora of weapons and items you can find throughout the world, there are literally dozens of ways you can become the Elden Lord. Meaning that if you feel like altering your build at any point, then there's plenty of options. However, regardless of how you fight, it's ultimately up to you on whether your chosen playstyle is effective in combat. If your character's build doesn't work with the weapons or gear you've selected, then you'll be left with two choices. Either improve your stats so your build is more viable, or swap out your present gear with something more favorable. It will take some trial and error, but in time you will find something that meshes well with you. Something that'll make you feel like a true badass crossing the boundaries of this vast fantasy land. Which is what makes From Software's combat so engrossing. As your enemies grow in power, so will you. In the beginning, you'll be taking on slow-moving soldiers with predictable attacks, but soon enough you'll be fighting mounted enemies, legions of soldiers, giants, and feral animals, until eventually you're facing off against dragons, avatars of nature, and literal gods. The combat has certainly come a long way since Demon's Souls. While the RPG elements have remained mostly unchanged, Elden Ring isn't afraid to build upon established gameplay mechanics to make itself more dynamic. One of the best new additions would have to be the riposte. It functions similarly to the parry, but it's much easier to pull off. Basically, whenever you block an attack, you can immediately launch a counterattack on an enemy. If timed right, then you can effectively deal a major blow to an opponent and leave them open for a combo attack. However, the trade-off is that if you mistime your riposte, then you'll be left wide open for your enemy. So much like parrying, riposting will require careful timing to be effective in combat. Still, this is easily one of my favorite mechanics in this whole game, and the fact that it can be implemented so easily seriously helps sell its value to the player. The same can be said for the jumping. In the past, From Software has made the jumping mechanics in their games a lot more complicated than they needed to be, more often resulting in you falling to your death for simply trying to leap across a small gap. The fact was, their games were more focused on the design of the environment itself rather than how you navigated it. But now by having a button dedicated entirely to jumping, it seriously opens up the traversal mechanics, making player exploration so much easier. It's a simple change, but it clearly had an effect on how they designed the open world, while also providing you with another way to fight your enemies. One that you'll quickly discover is effective at closing the distance between yourself and your opponent. Simply put, the jump button may be a small addition to the gameplay, but it makes a big difference for the game as a whole. Plus, the jumping attacks make the combat feel a lot more versatile than it already was. However, the jump mechanics aren't the only aspect of gameplay that's been tweaked. Another would have to be the stealth. Up until Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, sneaking around in a From Software game was more or less a means to just get a quick backstab. But in a game like this with a much larger world to explore and enemy encounters around every corner, stealth is a much more viable tool for the player. So just like jumping, there's now a dedicated crouch button, allowing you to easily switch between the two states at will. In this crouch state, you'll be able to move quietly past heavily populated areas, allowing you to avoid conflict and save your resources. Alternatively, you could quietly quietly skulk about, eliminating weaker foes before dealing with the larger threats. It's a mechanic that, depending on the situation, can seriously alter a fight in your favor. However, unlike games like Assassin's Creed or Metal Gear Solid, the stealth isn't overly complex. It is simply another option for engaging your enemies, one that will force you to consider your actions more carefully, but just don't expect it to solve all your problems. If used correctly, it can be exactly what you need to take on some of Elden Ring's more difficult combat encounters. If used poorly, then you have hordes of enemies swarming your location in no time. In situations like these, you may need to bring in some outside help, but if you're not interested in attempting the multiplayer, then thankfully there is an alternative. Widely regarded as one of the more controversial additions to the game, the Ash summons are basically a means for you to summon enemy NPCs to assist you in combat. In the past, being able to summon NPCs was merely a means to alleviate some of the stress in combat, especially against the bosses. However, usually they were only limited to specific areas. While this is still the case for Elden Ring, now you can actually carry your own summons with you wherever you go. Throughout the game, you can find a myriad of different monsters that you can summon within specific areas of the game world, basically ensuring you always have some help on hand if you're struggling at a particular fight. However, while the summons can be an effective way to give you some breathing room, they're not perfect. In fact, many of these summons are basically glass cannons that can be killed in only one hit, a flaw which is made more noticeable due to their AI being relatively simple. More often, they'll just charge at the enemy without any thought to their own safety. Despite the change in circumstances, they're still following the same code they were given when they were your enemies. But much like any weapon in game, every summon has the potential to be an effective tool in combat if used correctly and against the right opponents. That said, there are some in the community who say that using summons makes the combat too easy for you. To which I say, if you don't like them, then don't use them. It's that simple. If you prefer to fight all your battles by yourself, then go nuts. Nobody is stopping you. Elden Ring isn't a game that's going to force you to play a certain way. Rather, much like Breath of the Wild, it offers you the freedom to decide how you wish to approach the combat in game, whether it be fully armored with as many weapons and abilities as possible, or with as little as you require for your chosen playstyle. You can play Elden Ring however you want to. Besides, if there was ever a moment that the developers believed that a gameplay mechanic would make things too easy for the player, then I guarantee you that they would have removed it. From Software has done everything they can to make this game as challenging and engaging for the player as possible, whether by providing you with a plethora of new mechanics to master, or by simply tweaking already existing gameplay elements to make them more fun and less time consuming. For example, instead of having to constantly warp back to the hub world just to level up, you can instead do it from any side of grace in the game world. Speaking of which, if you die in most From Software games, then you'd be immediately transported back to the last side of grace you visited. However, in Elden Ring they've included a second type of checkpoint into the game, the States of Marika. These serve the same purpose as sites of grace, only you can't level up at them. Instead, if you die within close proximity to one, then you'll be given the choice to respawn at your last site of grace or at a State of Marika. This is an effective way to prevent backtracking, especially since they're often found outside the doors to boss arenas. In regards to your flasks, there's now multiple ways you can replenish them aside from just returning to a site of grace. Usually when you're out in the open world, if you defeat a group of enemies, then there's a chance that your flasks will be replenished. If that doesn't work, then you can just find yourself a scarab. They're a pretty common sight. Depending on whether they're red or blue ones, killing them will refill the respective flasks. This again saves you from having to constantly backtrack. The developers have clearly thought hard about how they can make Elden Ring not only challenging but also more accessible so that the players don't feel like they're constantly wasting their time. Like by removing weapon durability so you don't have to worry about repairing your gear. Or if you've reached the maximum number of a particular item in your inventory, then any more additions will be automatically placed in your sort chest for later use. An ideal inclusion considering you can now craft items in this game, from explosives to various arrow types to even objects that can cure you of in-game debuffs. There are many consumable items that can be created by the player, meaning that you no longer have to rely solely on shopkeepers to resupply. Plus, being able to craft your own ammo for ranged weapons would no doubt make them more viable gameplay-wise. It's pretty clear to me that From Software has not only effectively improved their combat, but also built upon the mechanics established in their previous titles, making Elden Ring not only their most accessible game, but also the most expansive. It doesn't just feel like another Dark Souls game, but a natural evolution of the Soulsborne genre, which is honestly very impressive, especially when you consider that this is From Software's first open world title and yet it doesn't feel like it. There's a level of quality present in this game's world that is sorely lacking in most other AAA games. While at first glance it may appear to be quite daunting in scale, much like the interconnected worlds of From Software's previous games, there is a simplicity to Elden Ring's open world. Firstly, while the game does give you a general direction of where to go via the Sites of Grace, you don't actually have to. In fact, there's nothing stopping you from simply wandering off the beaten path and exploring the game world. Especially since, with the exception of some late game areas, the entirety of Elden Ring is open to you right from the start, so you're effectively left to your own devices for the whole game. That said, if you're ever lost, then the Sites of Grace should set you back on the right path. These can be found all over the map, more often at key locations in the game world. Here you can level up, manage your gear, and upgrade certain items. Furthermore, you can only fast travel from one side of Grace to another, meaning that if you want to get around the map quickly, then you better keep an eye out for the faint glimmers of gold. Secondly, while on your journey you won't find any towns, settlements, or places filled to the brim with friendly NPCs. This is still a From Software game, so instead everywhere you go you'll find only danger waiting for you, with the only respite being at the Sites of Grace or the Round Table Hold. Despite the wide myriad of characters you can meet on your journey, Elden Ring is actually a very lonely game. You're effectively isolated, left to wander the wilderness by yourself, all the while at the mercy of whatever horrors lay hidden throughout. The oppressive atmosphere leaves you desperate for any form of companionship, but in such a vast land, who could the player call upon for aid aside from other players and the controversial Ash summons? It was this question that motivated the developers to make a major change to the Soulsborne formula, by providing the player with a mount that not only followed the same rules as the player character, but also had its own advantages in-game. Given to you by Millennia at the start of your journey, Torrent is a magical steed that can be summoned anytime and anywhere in the game world, with the exception of dungeons, castles, and other closed-off areas, of course. Since traveling the open world by foot would take too long, you'll need him in order to navigate this vast land at a fast pace, especially since he can double jump, allowing you to easily scale cliffs, cross large gaps, or even propel yourself skyward via a spirit spring. Furthermore, with the player having immediate access to this kind of speed, they'll be able to easily avoid enemy patrols, incoming projectiles, and even tackle some of the game's roaming boss encounters. It's one thing fighting a boss in an enclosed arena. It's something else when you're riding on horseback, minding your own business, only to see a dragon swoop down from the sky to do battle with you. Although I will say that combat on horseback can be quite tricky to get used to. Just like on foot, you have a light and heavy attack, both of which require careful timing and positioning in order to be used effectively. However, what you want to keep in mind is which direction you'll be attacking while on horseback, since there are specific buttons for attacking on either side of Torrent. Furthermore, whenever you attack on horseback, you'll start to slow down, leaving you open for a potential counterattack. Ideally, what you want is to try and stay mobile, keeping in mind which direction you need to swing your weapon, all the while keeping a close eye on your stamina should you need to retreat. So despite the fact you can now ride an animal into battle, the combat itself hasn't changed. What's more, if Torrent takes too much damage, then he'll despawn, requiring you to resummon him. Furthermore, if his health is fully depleted, then you'll need to use one of your flasks in order to revive him. So just like fighting on foot, it's best to manage your resources and if possible try to avoid taking damage. That said, if you believe combat on horseback is too difficult or not ideal for a particular situation, then don't worry. You can easily dismount at any time with the simple push of a button. Honestly, I wasn't expecting anything groundbreaking to emerge from a video game horse, but I was quite impressed with how effortlessly From Software was able to integrate Torrent into the gameplay. Whether to get the jump on my enemies, escape a difficult combat encounter, or to simply traverse the open world, he is as much a lifeline as your healing flasks and Sites of Grace. Without him, you'll be truly alone, left to wander the lands between on foot. As such, he's an essential component to the game's design, and without him it simply wouldn't be the same. Honestly, I haven't been this attached to a horse since Shadow of the Colossus. Much like Fumito Ueda's Titan-slaying epic, the open world of Elden Ring is a true marvel. No matter what direction you choose, you'll find something waiting for you, whether it be a dungeon, a boss fight, or an NPC with a story for you to decipher. There's so much to discover in this game's world that it's highly unlikely that you'll find everything during your first playthrough. I know I didn't. Even after completing the main campaign, I quickly realized that there were massive chunks of the map that I hadn't even touched yet. Dungeons and other hidden areas which had remained unexplored, along with entire questlines that I didn't even know existed. There's simply so much to discover that you could easily spend days just getting lost in the sheer magnitude of it all. Yet not once during my entire playthrough did it ever feel like the game was leading me to these discoveries. No, these revelations were mine to make, and should I make a mistake, then that would be mine too. Because much like From Software's other games, the only way I could truly advance was through trial and error, whether by recognizing environmental cues, understanding the best route to navigate through an area, or just by being wary of collectibles. There are plenty of lessons to learn, and if you're a quick study, then you'll be able to pick up on some of the game's more subtle design choices. Honestly, there's something so enticing about an open world game where you can easily miss so much, yet no matter the choices you make throughout the game, your experience will still be as genuine as any other. This is a game that doesn't require a long list of achievements, collectibles, or story missions in order to justify its size. It simply presents you with this massive world full of complex lore and allows it to speak for itself, freeing you of guided content and allowing the player to approach it at their own pace, all the while being complemented by some breathtaking music. From Software has always managed to nail the soundtracks in their games, but the music in Elden Ring might just be some of their best work yet. Many of these tunes sound as though they belong in Middle-earth or Narnia, which is ideal for an epic fantasy story. These songs have managed to evoke a real sense of wonder that's perfectly suited for the grand scale of the game world. Even some of the quieter and less grandiose tunes are able to maintain the atmosphere present in these hauntingly beautiful locations. But much like the gameplay, the most complex and awe-inspiring tunes can be found during the boss battles. It's here that the composers really show off their talents for creating evocative music. Every major boss encounter has a melody that seems to perfectly encapsulate not only their character but their story, leaving you in awe of their melody before you're swiftly cut to pieces by your enemy. In short, the soundtrack is awesome, and it's amplified further by some sweet sound design, which is a perfect blend of otherworldly sounds mixed together with more natural jingles. Granted, there are some sound effects which have clearly been reused from past games, but it hardly detracts from the overall experience. If anything, it reminds the player of how long a tenure From Software has had in the video games industry. But since this game is an open world title, the developers were clearly focused on providing their sound effects with as much diversity as possible, especially when it comes to the environment. From Software has worked hard to provide the player with as many tunes that were created by both your enemies and their locale, without having to sacrifice any of the more horrifying sounds that clearly belong in a horror game. So have no fear. There's still plenty of monsters in Elden Ring that'll terrify you long before you even lay your eyes on them. Of course, if the sound design isn't enough to put you on edge, then I'm pretty confident that the visual design will. While it may not evoke a sense of realism that's often found in other AAA games, Elden Ring really doesn't need to. From Software has always been a studio that prioritized style over the latest cutting-edge graphics. After all, who needs realistic textures when you're able to present the player with a jaw-dropping landscape inhabited by fantastical creatures? By focusing on style, they're able to give each of their games their own distinct look, which perfectly complements their mysterious narratives. Elden Ring is no different. If the vistas in this game aren't stunning you, then they're chilling you to the core. Every region of the lands between has its own themes and identity, with the history of those who inhabit it ingrained upon every locale you visit. Even the most forgettable locations in this game possess more depth than a typical AAA open world game. The same can be said of the NPCs. Every character in game has been given the same amount of care and detail that's present in the environments. Many even end up surpassing the design of Elden Ring's world just by looks alone. Furthermore, the enemies also feature all kinds of little graphical details that add so much more depth to the gameplay. For example, after killing an enemy, if there's a white flash, then that usually means that they've dropped something. Or how about if an enemy's eyes are glowing, then that means that they'll drop more runes than normal. It's visual cues like these that make me appreciate a game's graphics even more. Not to mention, it's a testament to how much trust the developers have in the player. To have faith that we'll be able to notice these little details and their significance without having to point them out to us. Honestly, it's quite refreshing to see, especially in an open world game. Elden Ring. What more can be said about this game? It is without a doubt From Software's greatest creation to date. It's taken everything that made the Dark Souls franchise so great and successfully brought it into the open world genre, supplying the player with a multitude of new gameplay mechanics, a vast land full of interconnected dungeons to explore and monsters to fight, all the while drip-feeding new weapons and gear to encourage player customization. Elden Ring is more than just an open world Dark Souls. It's an open-ended adventure that can be as difficult or as easy as you want it to be. Even after spending hours playing through the campaign and unlocking all of the trophies, there's still so much left to discover about this game's world. You could easily get lost in the sheer magnitude of the lands between for days on end. Safe to say that this is a game that we'll be talking about for years to come. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. I'm the Grave Tender, and thank you for joining me on the other side. Please consider subscribing, and I hope you all have a nice day.